Hey everyone, and welcome to Liquid Liner Notes, a podcast that brings you interviews from the beverage and music industries. I'm your host, Danny, aka Hip Hops on Instagram. For this week's episode, I have Tim Gormley, a co-founder of several Asheville, North Carolina-based companies in the beverage and music realm, including Burial Beer Co., Visuals, and Ceremony of Seasons. Tim, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, Danny. So awesome to be on. Thanks for having me.
I have, you were nice enough to reach out to me after I posted Mike from Is Was episode, and I was like, this is my chance. I need to reach out and see if he's interested because you're so intertwined in both of the things that I'm passionate about. So I for sure, you were on my list early. And then when you reached out to me, I was like, this is it. I got to take my chance.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It's funny because I've been kind of like telling some friends and coworkers about how I was recording this podcast, and people were asking me, what's it all about? And it was one of those things where as soon as I explained it, everyone was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I was like, yeah, this dude, like I've never met him in person, but he seems like my kind of guy. Like our Instagrams are oddly similar, like
Yeah.
music and beverage. It's my two favorite things, man.
Yeah. It's actually, my wife was like, I was constantly telling her about new breweries or new albums. She's like, you need to do something with this. Maybe she was sick of hearing me tell her about it, but it worked out.
No, I'm glad you are. And like, yeah, that Mike episode that you mentioned was the first one of the podcast I heard. And I don't know Mike that well personally. We've emailed a bunch of times, and we've shared some beer and wine and music and stuff like that. But I just really admire the hell out of him. And I even said to him when I was telling him like, oh, I heard the podcast, it was great. I was like, I could listen to you talk forever because he's just like super fascinating guy, with very talented. So, and then of course I've been kind of like going through listening to some old episodes, and yeah, I'm loving the show. So you're doing great.
I appreciate it. He's great, and I think that you are as well, just safe in the forefront. But I feel like you guys are great at like romanticizing it and still making it fun. The beverage industry.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, the romance of these things is really what drives me so much. Like they're such beautiful art forms in my mind, and I just want to like share them as much as possible.
I appreciate that. So how did you get into craft beverage to begin with?
I think it all started for me in college. I went to Penn State for college. This was back in like the very early 2000s. I graduated high school in 99. And I had some buddies kind of like that were a little bit older than me in college. And I remember one of them one day just asked me like, what's your favorite beer? And I was kind of embarrassed that I didn't have an answer. It was like at that point, I didn't really think about beer like that. It was just drinking whatever was cheap or whatever was available. And so that, and of course, like, being friends with them, they would share some beers with me, but it kind of just drove me to want to explore beer. And so, there was this bottle shop in State College, Pennsylvania, where Penn State is, that was kind of like, well, it was like a pool hall, but it had this like little room on the side that was like a bottle shop. And growing up in Pennsylvania, this concept was quite rare because Pennsylvania just has some super weird laws about beer. Like in Pennsylvania, what we call like, you have to go to a quote distributor to buy beer. And it was like this big warehouse full of beer, and you pretty much had to buy like a whole case at a time.
Wow.
So yeah, this was just kind of like a unique thing, at least at the time, for me to discover this thing. So I would just kind of go in there and buy like a mixed 6-pack of whatever looked interesting and take it home and try it. And yeah, I think it was, I've often said that the beers from Samuel Smith, the English brewery, were kind of my like epiphany beers, if you will. Beers that just, I was just like tasting those beers, was like, wow, I had no idea beer could be like this. And then it just kind of like blossomed from there. I was always like 1 year older than a lot of the people in my year. So I turned 21, I think at the end of my sophomore year. So I like had a couple years of college where I could buy beer. So um,
So
that
you
was
were pretty popular.
yeah, right, exactly. I know. And then actually, my mom bought me a like a Mister Beer homebrew kit as a graduation present from college, which was pretty cool. But it honestly was pretty intimidating to me at the time. And I remember I tried a few batches. Of course, for anybody that's ever homebrewed, Mister Beer kits do just pretty much point blank don't make good beer, right? But
Yeah.
the beers that I was making those first few times were just like garbage. I don't think that they fermented all the way. Like the bottles never carbonated right. And I just
Mhm.
kind of gave up on trying to homebrew, honestly.
Yeah.
Um, and then I lived in Philly for a couple years after I graduated. Philly was a really rad beer scene. Um, at one point I lived in Fishtown, which at the time was like not there wasn't a lot going on in that neighborhood. It's like bonkers now.
Is
But
Philly where like there's a big beer bar there? Is it Monks or something? I'm like blinking.
yeah, Monk's Cafe is kind of
Yeah.
like one of the I don't know, just like long running quintessential American craft beer bars.
I feel like it's Monks Cafe
Yeah,
and then like Tornado maybe. I don't even like what else would be a top. But no, that's I've
yeah,
never been to Philly, so
it, it was amazing, and that actually it was this is kind of a weird aside, but I don't know if you know the brewery Russian River in
yeah.
California, like another kind of epic, long-standing brewery. There was this period of time where like they were the only places they distributed their beer was California and Philadelphia, and it's
Yeah.
like people were like, "What? That makes no sense." But I think it was literally just for Monk's Cafe. Like the owner of that place became friends with them and just was like, "I need your beer."
I feel like I
It's
remember
cool.
didn't I feel like Monk's Cafe had like a Flemish red, like a sour red or something like that
They
they were
did, yes.
yeah,
There was a Belgian brewery. I don't remember the name which one it was, but somehow they kinda, like, contracted this Belgian brewery to make it for them, so it was like yeah, their logo was on the bottle. It was, like,
mhm,
made for them, which is really cool. And I was actually just kinda recent well, as we came up I guess we'll get to this a little bit later, but, um, the music venue that we just opened is called Eulogy, and, um coming up with that name took a really, really long time, and a lot of people had to weigh in on it. But the whole time I was like, man, I used to love the beer bar called Eulogy in Philly. That doesn't exist anymore,
mm,
unfortunately. But that was another one that was really great. So anyway, I guess I was saying that I lived in Fishtown. Fishtown was like one neighborhood over from Northern Liberties. Northern Liberties had this really amazing, kind of like sandwich shop slash bottle shop called the Foodery, and that was also like mix of six kind of place.
yeah,
And I had a roommate at the time who was also really into beer. So basically, him and I would go in, each get a 6 pack, share them with each other, and that was like a huge kind of year or two of my life of just like discovering so much beer. And then I eventually left Philly and moved to Seattle, just kind of more for an adventure than anything. I had no reason necessarily. I just thought it was a cool city, and I knew it had a great beer scene and a great music scene, and
yeah,
beautiful nature, and
yeah,
uh, so it kind of had all it ticked all the boxes for me. So moved to Seattle. It was 2007, and yeah, again, just like my my discovery of beer kind of like had another wave because all of a sudden it was like West Coast beer
yeah,
I had access to, and
yeah.
Seattle was great for that because pretty much like Seattle had access to almost all of the West Coast beer. So
That's pretty awesome. I heard you talking on another one about kind of doing like a quick tour of like Pacific Northwest. You know, like I think it was like San Fran, Portland, Seattle, and you picked Seattle.
Oh yeah,
I did. I haven't been to San Fran yet, but I did. My wife and I did a trip to like Portland, Seattle, Victoria Island, and Vancouver, and we
nice.
loved Seattle. So I can
Yeah,
totally like see why you would have picked that. It's
yeah.
beautiful there.
I mean, honestly, I love all three of those cities. They're all incredible. But yeah, at the time, it was kind of like, whether this was true or not, my thinking was like San Francisco felt a little bit too similar to Philly in some ways,
Yeah,
kind of like from a size perspective. And um, part of the reason why I wanted to get out of Philly was like because of the crime and stuff like that, which was really bad at the time. And I had a lot of friends and coworkers that were like, firsthand being affected by that, and it kind of freaked me out. So, uh, and then Portland just kind of felt like maybe it was going to be too big of a change from Philly. So, like Seattle was kind of like the happy medium,
yeah,
and yeah, I feel really fortunate that I picked that city. It was incredible, and of course, like all cities, it's changed dramatically since I was there, especially with like, Amazon and Microsoft being based there. Like it's grown so much because I think there's just so much money there.
yeah,
And a lot of my friends that that I met and hung with when I lived there have kind of like since almost been forced out because
yeah.
they can't afford it, which is a bummer. But
It is. Yeah, that's a bummer. And so, while you were in Seattle, is you said that your like love of craft beer kind of blossomed because you got to try some new stuff. But is that when you started to get back into brewing more?
yeah, it was actually my path to home brewing again was honestly a little odd. So I had met this. Well, there's a couple different elements to the story, but I guess ultimately the job I ended up finding in Seattle was very related to my degree, which was like business logistics or like supply chain management. And so I kind of had this like analyst type of job, and I was like working in spreadsheets every day, and it was fine, but it was, I had benefits, which was nice and all that stuff, but I was just like not loving it. And I just was so big into beer at that time as a consumer, and just kind of fantasized about working in the industry. But the kind of like the all the stories that you would always hear was like, it's so hard to get into the industry, it's so hard to get your foot in the door. And so that was kind of intimidating to me. But um, actually my girlfriend at the time and my sister, who was she moved out to Seattle with me. Actually, they one year they bought me like a kegerator as a birthday present, and that was super cool. And so I was like, okay, now I got to try to figure out how to buy kegs. And like oddly, it was really difficult to find places that would sell me kegs, or if they would, like if it was like a bottle shop or something, they would sell me kegs, but it would just be astronomically expensive. So I would like went to a bunch of breweries, tried to buy direct, and most people were like, no, we don't really like to mess with like selling to individuals. It all goes through our distributor or whatever. So eventually
Yeah,
I found this brewery called Lazy Boy Brewing, which was up in Everett, Washington, just north of Seattle. And they were like enthusiastic to sell me kegs, which was great. And they were affordable. And so I just started buying kegs from Lazy Boy all the time. And then just by doing that, I developed a good relationship with Sean Loring, who is still the founder owner of that brewery. He was very involved in the day to day, so he was there all the time. And uh, eventually, one day, I was just kind of like, "Hey, so who like what's your staff look like here?" And he was like, "Actually, it's mostly just me in the brewery. I got this one guy helping me out part time, but he's actually in the military and he's about to go overseas. So I'm actually looking for somebody if you know anybody. And I was like, oh, what? Okay. It just felt like I had to make a move, So
Yeah.
I went home that night and I, put together my resume and I wrote this like very impassioned cover letter and I sent it to him and he reached out to me and he was like, "Oh my God, that was like the best cover letter I've ever read." Like, he
Yeah.
was like, "What?" He was like, "Do you have a job right now?" I was like, "Yeah." I was like, "Do you have benefits right now?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Why the hell do you want to work at a brewery?" And so anyway, as it turned out, he was basically like, he was super cool about it. He was like, "I'll tell you, in my experience, a lot of people have this like romantic view of what it's like to be a brewer, and they come in and then they realize it's like mostly just cleaning and physical labor all day, and they quickly leave." So I was like, "I don't want you to quit your job, do this for a couple weeks, and then regret it. So why don't you just work on the weekends for a while and feel it out?" So I ended up working on the weekends at the brewery for a whole year,
Mm.
and kept my day job. And so it was a pretty intense
Yeah,
year.
it's pretty grueling.
Yeah, but I loved it, and I worked hard, and I learned as much as I could, and then and he gave me amazing opportunities to just like dabble in almost every area of the business, and then eventually was like, "You know what? I would love to bring you on full time." And I was actually the first ever like full time employee for that brewery, so it was kind of a big deal for them. Uh,
Yeah.
and so that was great. That was kind of like how I got my foot in the door. And it actually wasn't until I got that job and I was starting to help with brewing that I was like, man, I really should be home brewing right now. It's just going to vastly speed up my like learning process here and just like, hands-on experience. And so I had met Doug and Jess, who are my now business partners, out in Seattle, and we were drinking a lot of craft beer together. And so Doug and Jess and I basically all kind of like put our funds together to buy like a really solid all grain, like 10-gallon um, homebrew system. So we kind of like went all in, if you will, like
Yeah.
you know, on the homebrew thing. But I think there was kind of confidence there that we would figure it out since I was like learning on the job every day too.
Yeah. Did you just meet them like at the brewery? Were they like regulars or something? Or
The woman that I mentioned earlier that I was dating at the time that bought me the kegerator with my sister, she was actually working at the Seattle Art Museum with Jess. So
okay.
her and Jess became friends through working together. And then one day, I guess they were like, "Hey, we should hang out outside of work. Like, we should introduce our boyfriends to each other. They'd probably like each other." So we essentially had like a quasi double date, if you will.
Yeah.
And it was, yeah, just like kind of immediately fell in love with them as people. They were just very passionate people. And they were actually really passionate about wine, and not, they barely even drank beer. So that was kind of a really cool thing that we were able to bond over. Like, we were kind of teaching each other about the things that we loved that we
Yeah.
didn't know about. Um, but for whatever reason, beer ended up being the thing that we like really latched onto. And so then, yeah, I guess another part of the story was that at one point, not that long after Sean hired me at Lazy Boy, it was kind of it was kind of getting into autumn, and he was like, "Man, I'm so sorry to have to do this to you. I feel terrible, but like, we just feel like we can't afford to keep you on full time through the slower months." And I was like, "Oh shit, what am I gonna do?" So um, I was kind of scrambling to find a job, but Sean was like, "I'm gonna try. Like, I feel so bad. I'm gonna try to help you get a job." So he actually reached out to this homebrew shop that was also in Everett, and he was able to kind of convince them to hire me, um, which was honestly like that that opportunity is one of the things that I feel like what is perhaps the biggest moment like in my kind of arc to be where I am.
Yeah.
That was such a big thing, even though it felt like a terrible thing at the time. But working at the homebrew shop, I learned so much about brewing there. I mean, not only did the shop owner he had owned the shop for I think like a decade at least. So he had like an enormous amount of experience. His son was kind of like the more day-to-day manager, and he was like super geeky about fermentation. Everybody that worked there, of course, was passionate about it. So we're all kind of learning from each other. And then of course I had like all this access to all these ingredients that I got a discount. I could like literally just like mess with all the different grains that they had and smell it and taste it and um, try to learn about it. At one point, I was in charge of hiring the yeast, or excuse me, ordering the yeast. So
Yeah.
I basically had to learn about like every strain, and then people would constantly come in. This was kind of like before the internet was like a big thing where everyone got all their answers from the internet. People
Yeah.
would come in constantly and be like, "Hey, I'm brewing this and this happened and this doesn't seem right. Like, what do I do?" And most of the time I didn't know the answer.
Yeah.
So I would be like, "Let's figure it out," you know? And so that was huge for me because it was like, we all learn best from failure, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
got to learn from other people's failure before I failed, you know? So that was huge. So I ended up kind of working at the brewery and the homebrew shop part-time for a while, home brewing at the same time. And then Doug and Jess and I ended up starting this like beer blog. Um, so we were writing about beer, like reviews and current events, and like we would go to breweries and beer bars and just kind of like write about our experience. And it was really through doing that we ended up making a ton of connections in the local like scene. So
Yeah.
there kind of came this point where we would like go to bars and breweries, and people like knew who we were, even though we weren't, technically in the industry. I mean, I was, but
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway,
It gave you some kind of like not celebrity status, but like you had put your dues in, maybe not
right.
necessarily in the industry, but about the industry, and they
Yeah.
appreciated it.
Yeah, totally. And it was really it was because of that we really got to like live and breathe the camaraderie of the beer scene. And it was that made us, in my mind, it was that we were like, okay, we've got to start our own brewery. Like we need to be a part of this like subculture in a much bigger way. Um, if we don't do it, we'll regret it forever. Um, so that
Is
was
that
kind of like,
is that beer blotter still
yeah.
around? Is it still
Oh,
around?
well, I'm sure you could find it,
It's
but
deep in
it
the
certainly
interweb.
isn't active and hasn't been since probably we left Seattle, which was 2012. So,
Yeah, that's
um,
awesome. I'd heard you talk about that, and I was like, I wonder if you could still find those old writings. So just
I
be
know.
interesting.
Honestly, I haven't even tried because it's, I'm afraid, honestly.
Yeah,
I'm afraid to see what it was.
that's hilarious. But yeah, I love that idea of it was like early beer journalism. I mean, I know there was like people that were doing that, but at a local level. So that's yeah, it's really
Yeah.
and like smart to do that because I'm sure it wasn't that big of a thing at the time. Everyone was just like maybe writing on Beer Advocate at the time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, at the time, Beer Advocate and ratebeer.com were like the thing. Yeah, certainly before Untapped. And yeah, there was a couple like small beer magazines, like fairly low budget magazines, and they had websites and stuff like that. But yeah, there was certainly access to the types of things that we were doing. But yeah, like I think you make a good point that it wasn't necessarily as like localized. There wasn't really anyone doing it in Seattle at the time. or maybe there
Yeah.
was one other person doing it at the time. Um, so yeah, it was really fun, and I was kind of like my like thing was like beer reviews, and I would write these like 2-page long beer reviews to just
Yeah.
like totally waxing poetic, like borderline poetry about the beer. It was pretty silly, but I love doing it.
Yeah.
But
That's awesome. It's a good creative writing exercise.
yeah, totally.
So you guys decide that this is our chance. We're gonna regret if we don't decide to open our own place, and
Yeah.
then you guys start looking for geographic locations, or how? Like, what's the next step to that journey?
Yeah, so obviously, like I mentioned, like Doug, Jess, and I were homebrewing together, and we were writing this blog together. So it really made sense from that perspective that we would go into business together. But even deeper than that, Doug was an attorney at the time. He was working in construction law initially, but then he started his own practice at one point in Seattle, where he was focusing on like contract law specifically for breweries. So at the time, no one was doing this,
Yeah.
and like in like years later, after Doug stopped doing that and was like full time burial, I would like come across people that would be like, Doug was kind of like quasi famous in the law world for doing that. So I guess the one of my points here is that like Doug was an entrepreneur, a successful entrepreneur, um, as it was. So he kind of had that business savvy to him and
Hmm.
experience, like actually starting businesses from scratch. And then Jess was, like I said, she did work at the art museum. She's very passionate about art. She has a degree in like arts administration. She ended up a little bit later in our time in Seattle, ended up working for like some nonprofits. And, she had very much like this organizational mind and like knew a lot about doing like big events and stuff like that. So, and then I was kind of the production guy. So we had a really good team of people that kind of hit all the big angles that we needed. And so yeah, Doug and Jess actually had that they got married while we were living in Seattle, and then they had their firstborn son while living in Seattle, and they always knew they want to have 2 kids. And so they were like, we would really love, before we have the second kid, to move back to somewhere closer to the grandparents, if you will.
Yeah.
Uh, so, which totally made sense. And like, I honestly was bummed to some degree to leave Seattle. I really loved it there. But from my perspective, I was kind of feeling like Seattle was like a little oversaturated, which, you know, in hindsight is bogus. But
You mean
uh,
with breweries?
yeah, it just felt like there was a ton of breweries there, and it was like really kind of hard to stand out. And you had access to like the whole West Coast beer, and it was just, I ended up working for this other brewery after Lazy Boy called Sound Brewery, and I like really sought out that job. I was super amped on what they were doing. I thought they were making some of the best beer in Seattle, and I would tell people that I worked there, and I would constantly hear like, I've never heard of that place. And to me, for whatever reason, that was like telling that it was hard to stand out and make good beer, and yeah, like make a name for yourself there. So
Yeah.
anyway, Doug and Jess, they had family in like Ohio, New York, and Florida. And so they were like, we want to be closer to family, but not too close, I think is the way they put it to me. Um, so we looked at New Orleans, we looked at Savannah, we looked at Charleston, we looked at a bunch of different places. And I had actually been to Asheville to visit a friend that went to college in Asheville. And it was certainly on the radar for being a beer town back
Yeah.
then. Um, and so I had pitched the idea of moving to Asheville to Doug and Jess. I mean, to me, like in a similar way as how I explained moving to Seattle, was like it just kind of had it checked all the boxes for like what I look for in a place to live in. And they took a trip there, fell in love with it. they were like, let's do it. Let's move to Asheville. So um, we moved in fall of 2012. Um, I think I moved like maybe a couple weeks or a month after them. Pretty much landed at the same time. We hit the ground running looking for a spot for the brewery. We ended up finding a spot um, that is still to this day like our original location. We signed the lease on the first of the year of 2013 and opened the doors of the tap room June 15th of that year. So 6 months later. So it was like, truly like hitting the ground running. Like we got there, we got the pieces in place as fast as we could. We opened the doors, and of course we started as like a 1 barrel brewery. So
Yeah.
it was like very minimal investment.
Yeah, that was interesting. I heard you mention before that like you guys didn't have any bank loans or anything. It was like
Yeah.
you guys were doing it all on your own, which is pretty admirable and scary, but
Yeah.
maybe smart because then you're like everything you make is house money at that point.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that is fully true. And I was the only one that was kind of like getting paid initially. So Doug was was still doing the law thing. He had also started this kind of law adjacent software company
Mm,
with a partner. Um, so he was obviously working his ass off trying to like do basically 3 jobs in, when you include the brewery at once. And so yeah, they weren't taking a paycheck, which allowed us to just kind of reinvest. And
yeah.
so yeah, we just worked our asses off and made as much beer as we could on this little 1 barrel system. And we could only really be open a couple days a week because otherwise we would run out of beer. But people seemed to like it, and eventually we were able to just kind of save up enough money to expand. Eventually we were able to buy the building that we were in, which it was huge. Now, I mean, when we went into this building, I don't even remember people calling it the South Slope neighborhood, which is what
Yeah.
it's known as. Like, it didn't even really have a name because there was not much reason to go there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was like no man's land. And now it's like, people also refer to it as the brewery district. And it is one of the hottest, most like heavily trafficked neighborhoods in Asheville. So to be able to own the property alone is huge for us. But then, yeah, to be able to have our like original spot, our home base there, uh, has has gone really well for us. And
It's
yeah,
got
we
to
just
feel
kind of slowly expanded production.
it's
So
it's got to feel good to know that you were like an anchor in like revitalizing a community. That's pretty cool.
yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, Green Man was there, which is one of the longest tenured Asheville breweries that was there. But other than that, there wasn't much, and it was ended up being amazing. I mean, we've always had the mindset that like breweries being in close proximity to each other is a good thing. Uh,
Yeah.
it just makes if you've got a beer tourist, they're gonna want to go somewhere where they can try as many things as possible. So it's definitely that quintessential like rising tide lifts all ships sort of thinking. So and then of
I
course like
definitely.
having Green Man there, which was kind of an OG Asheville brewery at the time. Mike Karnowski was the head brewer, who he's gone on to start his own thing called Zebulon in Weaverville. But
Mm.
he was like a beer author. Like he had written books about beer. Like this guy is unbelievably knowledgeable about beer. So to have him there, like to like get advice from and stuff was huge. They would hook us up with yeast often. Um, and then like yeah, we ended up doing our first collaboration with Asheville Brewing Company, which is also like one of the OG Asheville breweries. So like that was another just element of the story that I'd be remiss to not mention, just how like we were these people that moved to Asheville from Seattle barely knew anybody. Started this crazy little one barrel brewery, and we were just like fully embraced with open arms by the community of not only of breweries, but the beer drinkers.
Yeah.
That was huge, huge.
Was that early time? Was that just kind of word of mouth, or what was the like marketing like for you guys? You were just hoping that it would catch.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think word of mouth was a lot of it. I remember in the early days, I ended up bartending a lot, just out of necessity, and so I would talk to a lot of the people that would come in, and it was amazing to me how many times people said, "Oh, I was at such and such place for dinner," and they were like, "You got to go to Burial." Like we would hear that all the time, which was
Awesome.
incredible. Like that we
Yeah.
were, being like talked about by these other businesses and bartenders and stuff like that. But also like we definitely put some work in to try to get like some press and stuff like that early on. Um, like the day we opened the door, there was like a line, like a pretty long line, which was amazing. So we clearly did something right to like get the word out, but
That's
it,
awesome.
it was also kind of challenging to be such a small brewery, and like I said, only be open a couple days a week, and sometimes like run out of beer and have to have like guest beers on. Like despite that may have very easily been like a negative or like disappointed customers. It worked for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right time, right place.
yeah, totally.
And I love the story of where the name came from and sort of like the look, like the artistry of
Yeah,
the brewery. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
yeah, sure. Yeah, the name. Well, the story that we very often tell about the name is that like it was really inspired by New Orleans and the concept of the jazz funeral. So Doug and Jess both went to grad school in New Orleans. They lived in New Orleans right prior to moving to Seattle, um, and that place has such an incredible, unique culture to it. And the jazz funeral is, I it's just, you know, unique is probably the best word I can think of, I guess. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
I've never really heard of anything quite like it anywhere else in the world. And basically, the concept is like when somebody passes away, instead of it being this like really somber, sad thing where everybody wears black and there's lots of crying and whatever, it turns into this like celebration of their life. So it turns into like the classic kind of second line, if you will. Like it's a parade through the streets. People are playing horns and drums and stuff, and um, people that don't even know the person that passed away end up joining in on the parade. And it's just this like really beautiful concept that kind of flips like death on its head a little bit. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think that kind of resonated with us from the perspective of just kind of like seasonality in general. Like obviously in the winter, plants die, they fall into the earth, they decompose. That ends up, feeding the earth with nutrients that leads to life in the spring. And so, like, death and life are it's a cyclical process. You need one to have the other. And we were often thinking of kind of beer brewing as being a somewhat cyclical process in itself. Obviously, beer is a agricultural product, um, so that was kind of where the name spawned from, and then from I kind of fell in love with metal music like early high school years. Still am a big fan of metal music, and there was this period of time where um, there was this website. I don't know if it still exists. It might exist, but it might not be like active. But it was called gigposters.com. And the whole purpose of this website was it was like a big database of like all these concert posters, and it was organized by the artist or by the band. And being a big music geek but also being like an art lover, I would sometimes spend like hours on this website just digging in, like thinking of bands that I liked, checking out their posters, finding poster artists that I really resonated with, and kind of like trying to follow the things that they made. And so we have this name, Burial. It felt kind of dark and metal. Uh,
Yeah.
and so we were trying to come up with like the branding, and branding was really important to us, just being art lovers. And like I said, Jess, like, art was her career at one point. So we really wanted to make sure we had like a strong visual brand. And so we were all kind of like throwing ideas out there, but I was kind of dead set on this idea of like working with a concert poster illustrator. So
Yeah.
I had initially pitched this artist named David D'Andrea, who was based in Portland, who did a lot of concert posters for the band Sleep. Uh,
Mhm.
and I just really love his art. Was like, I mean, it's absolutely beautiful and intricate and very like organic, I guess is the best word I can think of. Like very like nature based, which was kind of a thing that we were like, yeah, that made sense to us, kind of along with everything I just said, and then
Yeah. Yeah.
also just kind of leaning into something a little on the psychedelic side as well. We had actually reached out to David D'Andrea, sat down with him. He actually ended up designing our logo, the sickle logo, which we use a little bit less these days, but we used it for many years. He was We were trying to work with him initially, and then it kind of fizzled out, mostly just because he was really busy. He didn't have a lot of time for us, but I think also part of it was like his work was so intricate that it took him a really long time to make every piece. And so it just ended up, unfortunately, not making sense for us.
Yeah.
Then I had pitched this guy, David Paul Seymour, who he did a lot of work for like more doom bands, or like kind of heavy psych bands like stoner metal, that world. And I really loved his style as well. So he actually had this really great website that had like this page on it. It was like, hey, you want me to do art for you? Like, this is the whole process. Like, this is how you reach out to me. And I was immediately like, all right, this is very professional. Like, this is what we need.
Yeah.
Reached out to him. He was super into it. And then it ended up turning out that he was actually an architect as his day job, and did illustration on the side as like a side hustle. And so again, like he very much understood like the business side of it, which was huge for us. Like, it just made everything move so much like faster and smoother. And so we've been working with David ever since. It's been, probably about 10 years since we've been working with him. And he's an incredible person. He actually lives in Minneapolis.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So everything that we do with him is virtual, if you will. Though he's been to Burial a few times. Every time he comes, we like build an event around it. He's done like art shows at Burial. Um, so yeah, his art and our brand are just, so tied together. And it's really a beautiful, like, long relationship.
I feel like you guys, there's a lot of breweries that do the metal thing, but I feel
Yeah.
like you guys really took it a step further. Like there's something that's still where a lot of those breweries kind of blend together. There's something that still separates like your guys' visuals versus everyone else. And I think that
Yeah.
it's probably, yeah, that care that you guys put into it, and having you who was into that concert posters, but then also Jess with the art background probably
Yeah.
helps elevate it a little bit.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And also, like, Doug and Jess are not into metal. I mean, they're not like averse to it necessarily, but it's not a thing that, so for them, and obviously we were, all contributing to the art. It's evolved. The process has evolved a lot at this point, but early on we were all involved in the art, so we all kind of had these different sides and takes on it. We were also Jess's like favorite kind of era, I guess, of art was Flemish art. Like Hieronymus Bosch is the kind of example that I always give because his art is just so iconic and psychedelic and weird, but also dark. And
Yeah.
she was super into that. She introduced it to me. Um, and so that was always like an inspiration. And so, yeah, like it was always this dichotomy. We actually had this really cool thing that we did for many years on all of our cans once we started canning, that we called it internally the light side and the dark side. So every can had two unique pieces of art on it, which was pretty much unheard of in the
Yeah.
industry at the time. And it cost us more money. It was more work for David, but it was a really cool concept. So it would basically, the two pieces would be tied in some way, and they would tell this kind of story about the beer. But one side was kind of like the dark side, the death
Hmm.
element, and the other side was the light side and the like life side. And sometimes it was almost hard to tell which was which. They blended a little bit, but that was a really cool thing that we did. And so I guess hopefully it's evident that like we've always put so much time and effort into creating an experience with our beer that goes beyond just like how it smells and tastes. And all of our beers still to this day, even though the names have kind of become like this joke almost at this point. Um, and the art is sometimes pretty crazy. There's always a story behind it, like what the inspiration for that concept was, and how it ties into the beer, and like or the brewer when they were making the recipe or brewing the beer, however it is. There's always like a story there, and it's always been important to us that um, we create some sort of experience. And obviously, a lot of people can't necessarily have the experience of being at our tap room, right? So they're
Yeah.
drinking the beer at home or out at a bar or whatever. And so to hopefully it creates some sort of intrigue. It's not always like evident like what the backstory is, but just be like, why is this beer called that? Like, where did this art come from? How does it all tie together? And I've always felt like if you can cause people to ask those questions, you're already in a dialogue. uh,
Yeah.
and then that's the opportunity to tell the stories and hopefully provide like a context that makes you appreciate the beer more because of it. So
Yeah. And I feel like you guys have done a good job. Like you were saying, it's sort of like you have this surface level enjoyment of it if you don't want to think too deep about it. It's
right,
just really cool looking artwork, or
right,
even the name Burial.
right,
But then if you want to dig into it, there's like this beautiful backstory that creates that experience, like you were saying. So I think it's pretty awesome what you guys have set up and got going over there, and continuing into other things.
right. Yeah. Well,
Um,
thank you. That means a lot.
yeah. And I wanted to touch. So I know you were the head brewer there for 5 years, but you were mentioning the experiential side of things, and I feel like after that 5 years of being the head brewer, you've really taken a lot of different roles,
Yeah.
and sort of focused on that experience aspect of it, because I think that that's not only in breweries but in even in like retail, like the experience part of it is such a huge part of everything now.
Right. Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I feel lucky that I've been able to kind of well, I mean, we put focus on that really from day one, but to be able to kind of dial it in a little bit more, to put a little bit more headspace into it has been good. And we're currently working on our sixth location,
Yeah.
which is pretty crazy. Like, and honestly, our goal always with this was to not create like a cookie cutter thing. Like the all six of them are a different, unique experience, and like honestly, at times that bums people out. We've gotten a lot of like feedback about like when we opened Raleigh or we opened Charlotte, people were like, "Oh man, this is like nothing like the place in Asheville, and I love that place," and it's like, that's cool. Like, we didn't go anywhere. Like, you can still come see us, but
Yeah.
we wanted to create a different experience. And that's another thing that just comes with like when you have three founders that all have a little bit different backgrounds. And then, of course, at this point, we have over 100 employees and we have a lot of people that weigh in on this stuff. Everybody's got a little bit of a different experience, a little bit of different things that inspires them. And so we try our best to kind of integrate all these different elements and like make it so that in a perfect world, you kind of want to like, you want to experience all of our places and get a little bit of different thing out of it.
I feel like if they were cookie cutter or like, like franchises almost around,
Yeah.
it's sort of like the original location loses its luster, like there's no
Right.
reason to go there. There's nothing special about it.
Right.
But I think
Yeah.
it's
A great point.
as someone, I mean, I'm not someone who is attending those other ones and being like, oh man, I wish it was like the original location. But
Right.
from someone on the outside looking in, I think there's like a cool concept behind doing something like that can make things last and make things more special.
Yeah, I hope that that's true, and also just like I've always been a firm believer in, um, just like staying curious to like follow your inspiration, to be like fully committed in what you do, because I feel like if you're kind of forcing it like ever, then
Mm-hmm.
you're never giving your all, and you're never, it doesn't feel authentic. It just loses some of the X factor, and so we have different, we have eclectic taste, I guess is a good way to put it. But also like I'm I'm kind of like, I have that sort of ADD, ADHD kind of mind where it's like I get bored quick with things,
Yeah.
and like learning about new things, like diving deeper into new experiences, new products, new, look, feel of a space, just keeps me like really interested and focused and excited to produce something. I feel like if we were just kind of doing a thing we've already done before, I would I just wouldn't be able to infuse the like passion as well, and
Yeah.
then it just wouldn't be as good of a thing. Uh,
Yeah.
so that's kind of the approach, I guess, in some ways.
And I'm gonna run down because I jotted them down. So you have the original South Slope location, and I'm probably not going to put these in order of when you opened them.
Yeah,
So
no worries.
I don't know if that's important or not. But you have a forestry camp, which I had the really cool story of being part of the FDR Civilian Conservation Corps and being
Yeah,
owned by the U.S. government at once. Um, and that one has a restaurant. Is that correct?
that is correct. Yep, that is also in Asheville, just a
Okay.
couple miles away from the original location, and in the what they call the Biltmore Village neighborhood. And yeah, it's really incredible property. But yeah, that's where we have our main production facility
Okay.
now. So the vast majority of the beer that we make is coming from that property. There's actually, what, 6 buildings on the property.
Oh wow.
So yeah, because it was an old forestry service camp essentially. So it's 2 acres with a bunch of buildings on it, and we bought the whole thing. So we utilize every building for a different thing. But one of the buildings, the building that we felt like kind of had the most like character to it, that ended up being the tap room slash restaurant. It has 2 floors to it. It's really, really beautiful. The whole property is super cool. And that's where we host like Burn Pile, our big fall festival. We do all of our tours. Our tour program has been really like ramping up over the last couple of years. That's where we host those. So, and that's mostly where I work every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's I need to get there sometime because yeah,
Yeah.
like I said, I've only been to the South Slope, but And then you have House of Relics in Charlotte and the exhibit in Raleigh.
Yep.
And then I have Eulogy, but did you say that there was another one? Am I missing one?
So Eulogy is the fifth one, and that
Okay.
was just opened like late last year.
Yeah.
Um, so we're building the sixth one now,
Okay.
which will be the Visuals rooftop bar, which is right above like the roof of Eulogy. So, and I think it's Eulogy is also in Asheville, and it's literally right next door to our original location. So we just got super lucky that that building became available, and it fit our vision for the next project. And so now between the OG South Slope tap room, Eulogy, and Visuals, once Visuals is open, you have this kind of like campus almost of experiences all being pretty unique from each other. So you can just kind of like bounce around and explore all within one space, which is super fun.
Yeah, it's a cool concept. I mean, you got two locations where you kind of have like the campus feel, I guess, and
Right.
there's a lot of things you can do with that. So it keeps it interesting for you, like you were saying.
No, it is. It's extremely interesting. Yeah, it's a good word.
And then just for people who maybe aren't familiar with burial, what kind of styles are you guys focusing on? And you don't have to go into like super big detail on it, but what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, our approach was really from day one to offer a lot of different styles. I think that we've certainly come to be known for certain styles. We were a professional brewery during the haze craze, if you
Yeah,
will,
yeah,
of hazy IPA, which was a really fun time to be a professional brewer and to kind of learn and see how all these brews were all kind of like trying to figure out how to make hazy IPA. But anyway, IPA undeniably became the most popular style, and we'd be uh, shitty business owners to not make a lot of IPA, honestly. And it is a style that we love. I mean, my relationship to hops has really changed a little bit through the years, but I've I'm to a place right now where I look at hops with such reverence. I've kind of I've really always been obsessed with botanicals in general, and hops are a botanical, right? And
yeah,
they're so unique and so aromatic. And um, anyway, we make a lot of IPAs. We also, I feel like, are fairly well known for our stout program. We make a lot of imperial stout. Actually, I think like I can't say that this is a fact, but I would be shocked if we're not making more like individual brands of imperial stout than almost anybody out there. We literally brew an imperial stout every single week of the
wow,
year. And we almost release one every single week of the year. At least we did in the like heyday of this program. And then, yeah, we really love all styles, and we make a lot. We make a good amount of lager. We've always loved lager, and we've always made a good amount of it. But I feel like now that it's starting to be a little bit more popular,
hmm,
then we've been trying to lean into that a little bit more. We have a pretty rad sour beer program that has kind of ebbed and flowed through the years as far as like how prolific it was with releases. That style is kind of popularity of that style has kind of changed a lot through the years. But
yeah,
we actually we find that we move a pretty good amount of it on draft. So we're making making a decent amount of sour beer. Yeah, here we have a few different fooders that we use for like foeder aged a lot of times lagers, but sometimes like English style ales or something like that. Um, our goal is to have a really diverse tap list. Uh,
yeah, which is always appreciated from.
yeah, we really want to just be as inclusive as possible, and that certainly segues into the fact that we make things other than beer now.
Yeah.
Just really wanting to. I mean, we come from a place where Asheville is a very tourist centric town. A lot of the people that come through our door are that don't live in Asheville.
Oh wow.
So we see a ton of big groups that come in where maybe there's only a couple people in that group that are like super amped on beer and like want to do the brewery tour thing. And so you have other people in the group that, you want to be able to offer them something cool, something delicious, something interesting. And when we can offer them something that we actually make
Yeah.
ourselves right there and you can't get anywhere else, that's pretty cool. Like that just kind of ties back to the experience thing that we're trying to create. So
Yeah. And so before I jump off of the Burial brand, surfing your website, do you guys roast coffee?
oh yeah, good question. This is kind of a new venture for us. Um, but we don't roast it ourselves. So we
Right.
partnered with a coffee roaster that we have become super close with, that we admire the hell out of. And so it's kind of like a private label sort of situation, but we work extremely closely with them on um, what the coffee is going to be. And a lot of times, at least so far, a lot of times it's been blends. And so basically what our process is, our vision was like, we make a lot of beer with coffee in it. We love
Yeah.
coffee beer. We love coffee in general. And I feel like as far as non-alcoholic beverages go, um, coffee is the closest one to beer in the sense that it's the amongst non-alcoholic beverages, it's the most like um, community based, if you will. So like, people go to coffee shops like they go to tap rooms, and
I like that.
they hang out and they meet each other, talk to each other. And so that's one of the things that kind of drove us to make coffee as well. But we just thought it would be really cool to be able to say, hey, we make this beer skillet
Yeah.
donut stout is a good example, right? We make this beer skillet. It has coffee in it. We put a lot of effort and time and energy into figuring out like what that coffee is, so that it really sings in the beer and it makes sense with the other components of the beer. And so how cool would it be to be able to actually offer that coffee side by side, and you can kind of take them both home. So generally our process with coffee is like, all right, we want to make this coffee beer. We feel like this is the profile that we want in the coffee to make the beer the best beer it can be. So that's the starting place. And then once we get the coffee to where we want it to be for the beer, then we bag it up and sell it as is. So yeah, that's been really fun. And just another kind of thing that we can offer that we put some like soul into.
Yeah, no, I saw the coffee bags, and then I saw the coffee sodas, and I was like, I gotta ask about this because I've never heard of coffee sodas, and I,
Right.
I hadn't heard if you were doing that, but that's yeah, super cool.
Yeah, the
Uh,
coffee soda thing is just kind of like we wanted to make non-alcoholic beverages. We do make we like kind of like a hop water type of thing, like some seltzers, non-alcoholic seltzers, and we're trying to kind of evolve that program and make it more robust and bring in some new things. We also do non-alcoholic beer, but
oh, really?
yeah, it's
Are you guys
so
doing
far
like the?
it's draft only, and we use the like low attenuating yeast, so we don't like strip the alcohol out or anything like
Is that
that.
like
But
the? So that's not like the reverse osmosis or whatever the big thing
no, it's
is.
just really cool, like fairly
Just
new, or at least new to me. Ferment yeast product that's basically like a very low attenuating. It has like a very low alcohol tolerance. So it'll only really ferment until it's like 0.5% alcohol, and then it'll stop fermenting.
does it
Uh,
leave like a lot of residual sugars, like a kind of a sweet base then?
well, we make the wort be like very kind of low gravity
Okay.
initially. So I mean, yes, it's sweet. It's not a dry beer, but it's not like exceptionally, it's not like out of
Yeah.
normal range of sweetness for beer.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, but we don't have really a good way to pasteurize or anything like that. So we don't really have great confidence to put it into a can or a bottle right now. So
Yeah. I've
it's
been reading a lot about the concerns with, yeah, non-alcoholic stuff going out into the world and
right.
sort of being out of the brewery's control and what can happen.
Yeah, it's draft only for us now. But honestly, I'm like really, I can't take any credit for this, uh, but I'm very proud of the beers that we make. We put a lot of energy into that, of course, and did a ton of test batches. And um, I do drink those beers pretty regularly, actually. Like, the older I get, the more I try to limit my alcohol consumption. And there's so many opportunities where, it's like a social engagement at the brewery that I feel like awkward not drinking a beer. Just like, so I'll get the non-alcoholic beer, and like, I think they're delicious. They're really good in my
Yeah.
opinion. So
Yeah, I've been enjoying like trying different ones around just to give it a shot.
yeah,
But yeah, so we can move to visuals.
sure.
Yeah. So visuals is your guys' wine program is sort of like your primary focus right now. Is that
Exactly.
correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And it's not even just wine, I should say. It's wines, aperitifs, and ciders. Is that still?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I mean, basically the story of that is we had, well, like I had mentioned a while back in this conversation, when I first met Doug and Jess, they were really into wine, and they continued to be really into wine. And um, we kind of reached a point where, like, man, we have invested all this money and all this equipment that's designed to ferment things. Maybe we could ferment wine, and maybe even more, even predating that thinking was like, we were finding that we were selling a lot of cider in the tap rooms, but the cider we were selling was cider that we were buying from other producers and reselling. And we we live in an area of the world where, like, there's a lot of apples grown around here. Hendersonville, which is kind of like a neighboring town, is like the apple capital of North Carolina. And so we were like, we have all these apples here. Why don't we just make cider? We're selling a ton of it. We make it ourselves. And I don't know if this is true in every state, but in North Carolina, cider is considered wine, fruit-based fermentation. And we would need a separate license to make wine than we need to make beer. So it was a little bit of a process for us to get our license to make wine, but kind of started off making cider. And then we, through some connections that really Doug had made with some winemakers out on the West Coast, we started to source grapes, wine grapes, and basically ship them across the country and ferment them in Asheville in our beer tanks. And so that was that. I want to say the first year we did that was maybe like 2018 or so. Initially, when we did it, we only made like two wines, and we pretty much knew that we didn't know what we were doing, and so we kind of went into it being like, with like no expectations that it would be like sellable as
Yeah.
wine. But we also knew that we had done various like beer wine hybrid type of things, like using wine grapes or blending, um, and essentially making a beer, that has wine like character in it. So we're like, that's always an option for us if this doesn't work. And then another option that we had thought was like, like I said, I love botanicals. I fell in love with Amaro and vermouth, and just kind of that broad world of botanical wines. And I was like, I would love to make some kind of vermouth adjacent thing with this stuff if it doesn't turn out. So that was kind of what we did initially. And then the winemaker that we were working with, his name is Chad Stock. He was helping us with sourcing grapes from Oregon, like the Willamette Valley area of Oregon. And he was very much like our go-to, like, for information. I mean, we were on the phone with him all the time trying to like work through issues and just figure out how to make wine. So he was very critical to us early on. Eventually, he actually left the wine industry, and so we had to. He's back in it now, but he kind of temporarily left it, and so we had kind of scrambled a little bit to find another source, and we ended up connecting with Evan Lewandowski of Ruth Lewandowski Wines, which at the time was actually like technically based out of Utah,
Mm.
but he was sourcing his grapes from California, and so we then kind of shifted to buying grapes from California, but we were still shipping them back to Asheville. And we had hired a winemaker because at the time I had no experience making wine, but we things kind of didn't work out that well with the winemaker. It was kind of a short lived thing, and it kind of started to dawn on us that it was not very smart to basically put grapes on a truck from California and bring it to North Carolina, because the way we were trying to make wine, like using native yeast, um, you really need to like you really need to put your hands on the wine like at least twice a day, every day in the early stages, or else it'll start to want to turn into vinegar because that's
Mhm.
what grape juice wants to be. And so we would get the grapes and they would already kind of start to ferment on the truck. And we would kind of we were just like, man, we're off on the wrong foot. Like from day one that these grapes get here, and we're trying to make great wine. So this isn't smart. Um, so we had decided to basically shift the production to where the grapes come from.
Mhm.
And I might be telling the story slightly out of order, but essentially in uh, 2019, I pretty much left the brewery to like as far as being a brewer to focus on opening forestry camp. That was kind of like a year-long project. I was kind of like the project manager, kind of like visionary, I guess you could say, for that space. And then it opened in late 2019. We all know what happened early 2020. Uh, the restaurant at Forester Camp just kind of morphed into something very different for a little while. Um, and then we were having some staff that were, either getting sick or kind of terrified of getting sick. And so we had
Mhm.
some people that kind of didn't come to work for a
Yeah.
spell. So basically, Doug and Jess were like, "Hey Tim, we really need you back in the brewery right now while we work through whatever the hell we're gonna do with COVID." And so I jumped back in the brewery for a little while, and obviously because I was back in the brewery, Forestry Camp needed somebody else to like oversee it. So we found people to kind of go in that place. So once COVID kind of settled out, and we were like, "Okay, we're good. Like the business is not going to be over forever."
Yeah.
I was kind of in this unique place to be like, choose my path forward. And so I had this, we had started this visuals brand, but like no one was focused on it really. No one was dialing it in. No one was growing it. So I was like, I'm really interested in this. I think it's a really cool opportunity for me to learn like a whole nother side of fermentation, to make new connections in a kind of adjacent industry. And so, thankfully, my business partners were like, great, like, yes, do that. That'll be really helpful for us. And also like, I kind of needed a thing to like put my creative energy into. And
Yeah.
that was, it kind of reached a point where the brewery was, at least as far as like the actual like production of the brewery, we had really streamlined it and put a lot of like talented people in place to make the beer. And like, I just didn't really have like a clear place to insert myself, without
Mhm.
like mucking it all up. So it worked out on a lot of different levels, for me to focus on visuals. And so, um, anyway, I, when we started working with Evan Lewandowski and we started to shift the wine production out to California, since he had moved from Utah to California, he's kind of planted in Healdsburg, um, which is Sonoma County. just north of San Francisco, kind of quintessential wine country. He was making wine in this and still is in this like co-op of winemakers. So it's a bunch of different winemakers all kind of making wine under the same roof and like sharing equipment and sharing knowledge and sharing staff. And um, so he was like, yeah, I think we can make this work. We can find a space in this co-op for y'all to kind of be like your spot. And so we essentially like contracted with him to make the wine. And so I think it was 2021 was probably the first year that I went to harvest. So I went for a whole month during grape harvest. And I basically said to Evan, I was like, pretend like I work for you, put me to work. I want to learn like I learn best on the job. I need to figure out, at that point I like, had a pretty good, like kind of like a book level
Yeah.
knowledge about making wine, but I didn't have like much hands-on experience. And so that was an amazing, enlightening experience. And like, obviously I learned so much that I could then apply to making cider. So we do make all of our cider in Asheville at the forestry camp location, and I, for the most part, I get help from other production staff here and there, but for the most part, like I'm the one doing all of that production. Um, and we take a very similar approach with the cider program. It's like natural
Yeah.
cider, if you will. So native yeast fermented. And it's all aged like for the most part about a year in oak. So it's all like oak aged, neutral oak aged cider.
Mm.
So yeah, our cider is like, it drinks a bit differently than what some people, or maybe the more like common American cider drinker is used to. It's all like fully and completely dry, no
Yeah.
residual sugar. It's kind of funky and wild, if you will. It's got like a lower pH. It's a bit sour. There's certainly been times where I actually quite regularly notice when I look at reviews, which is rare, but when I do, people are like, if you told me this was beer, I would believe you.
Oh wow.
Like sour beer.
Yeah.
And of course, it's gluten free, which is nice. And so yeah, that's kind of like most of our cider goes to draft. So we do bottle it here and there, but it's mostly draft. And then
Mostly draft. Yeah.
yeah,
And
and
does visuals have like a cool background story for the name, like burial?
not as cool. Doug came. I'm almost positive Doug came up with that name, and I loved it immediately. And like, I don't even know honestly what. I'm sure he told me at some point why he came up with that name, but I've kind of, I guess, through the years, kind of come to create my own reason for the name. And I mean, I just always say that it's really like it's about psychedelia more than anything. It's like visuals that you might have on a trip, and that sort of stuff, really inspires me. And I think I love the name. I love what it evokes. Um, and that's really
Yeah, no, that's
it.
perfect.
Yeah.
But speaking of like the visuals of it, I feel like you guys didn't just take like the easy way out and be like, okay, we're just gonna make this an extension of burial.
Right.
Like it feels like it's its own thing. Like
Yeah.
the look of everything is like these beautiful. The labels are like these beautiful nature shots, and it's like it feels like it's its own separate thing. And I feel like maybe that could have like been a little more difficult to get that off and running, like not just like piggybacking, directly from burial.
Yeah.
But
No,
I think it's like a beautiful look, and maybe that was like intentional. I don't know.
yeah, no, no, thank you. It means a lot to me because the look of visuals is very much kind of out of my brain. And um at this point, I've taken a good amount of the photos that end up being on the labels. Um and it's, yeah, it's kind of like personal to me, I guess, on some level of just like I'm a huge nature lover, and but also like I love kind of like brutalist architecture and like really like angular stuff. I'm like kind of obsessed with the 80s and some of the art that comes with the 80s. And so there's like these kind of subtle like graphic geometric overlays that are part of the art. Um, but yeah, the it's interesting because when we first opened forestry camp, we very intentionally tried to kind of like separate forestry camp from the burial brand. That was our first real like venture into doing that. And our thought was like, our vision for the space was that we wanted to make this kind of elevated dining experience and get really nerdy about beverages. So like we didn't really want it to be a tap room. We in the early days we only had a handful or like 2, 3 burial beers on draft. It was all like guest beers. We had this massive wine cellar, all these different super cool wines that we were inspired by. We had a coffee program, a tea program, cocktail program. Like it was super geeky, like kind of the type the types of places that when we would find when we traveled that we would just be like losing it over like what am I going to order? I want everything. Like that was kind of the type of experience that we wanted to make. And we ended up kind of like learning a hard lesson there where like we didn't kind of like what you're alluding to, like we didn't lean into the kind of brand equity that we had built for burial. And so it was like starting from scratch. Or the flip side of that was we would get people coming in that knew that it was a burial thing, but they had very distinct expectations of what a burial thing was, and it was not that.
Yeah.
Uh, and that, in at times, we would blow people's minds like we hoped, but other times people would be disappointed because it wasn't what they expected. So we kind of since had like um, slowly and meticulously like evolved forestry camp back into like more of a tap room vibe. And that's been good for us. But the visuals thing, we kind of in some ways had a similar take on it, where it was like uh, we pretty strongly felt that the beer audience and the wine audience, though there's certainly some crossover, we're kind of like two separate audiences, and I think that that's proven true, at least in my experience. And also, just like I was saying earlier about our spaces, like I get inspired by different things. I love visual art of many different types. And don't get me wrong, like I love the burial branding and I love David Paul Seymour, very proud of it. But it was just kind of like it felt like an opportunity to do a different thing that I also love.
Yeah.
And so we kind of went with that. And yeah, I mean, it has felt like a new startup in a lot of ways. It has felt like a lot of work to like get exposure for it. And as much as Burial talks about visuals and serves visuals at all of its locations, um, I still meet people every day that don't know what visuals is or don't realize that we make it. Um, and to me, like, I guess on some level that's a little bit disappointing. Like, obviously, I want it to be successful, but I um, also kind of like it in some ways too, because there's less expectation necessarily. There's more opportunity to kind of like tell the stories, explain to people what it is. And I enjoy doing that. And so it just feels like a little bit more like free, I guess you could say. So I
Mhm.
can do, I can like, I'm a little bit less restricted on my like creative whims, I guess you could say. And
Yeah.
that's like really awesome. And also kind of has like underdog vibe, I guess, or whatever. Like I love I generally love things, art, music, whatever that's like under the radar, because I feel like, I know that that can sound like pretentious sometimes to say, but I think the at the core of it, I just love the process of discovery. Like I love stumbling upon a thing that is super cool, but that
Mhm.
wasn't like force fed to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I want to be that with the visuals brand for other people. I want to feel like they can be the one that like tells their friend, "Yo, have you ever seen this visuals thing? Have you ever tried this wine?" Because that I get so much joy out of being able to be that curator. I love gifting that to other people.
Yeah. I love that concept. But with the wine, I know a lot of people like to throw labels on things, and like right now you hear like a lot of like pet nat or low intervention.
Right.
Would you like use that or natural? I've seen you guys specifically use, what's like maybe the terminology that you like to use with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one that I grapple with, to be honest with you. Um, I do, uh, from my experience, which is fairly minimal. Still really only been doing this wine thing for a few years now. Um, there's a lot of people have a very, yeah, I guess distinct like thing that pops into their mind when they hear natural wine.
Mm,
I do think that undeniably it's like kind of it's becoming a term that people recognize. It's kind of trendy, I guess you could say, or whatever. And so I've had so many conversations with people about what our wine is, and it just starts to get. It's one of those moments where people's eyes start to glaze over. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
you start to learn pretty quick. Like, don't overwhelm people because you're speaking a different language. And so, I guess the reason why I like to use natural wine, or I do on occasion, is that I think that people generally do understand um, what that means, or it's just fairly fun and easy to explain to people what that means if they
Yeah.
don't know. But then you have your other people that are more dogmatic about what natural wine is, and they think that it has to be like this. From a production standpoint, it has to be like this very specific thing that we may or may not do. Um, I Working with a lot of winemakers when I'm out in California, not only Evan, but just like other people in the co-op, other friends of theirs that end up coming across. I've noticed that a lot of them try to kind of shy away from natural, like using that word, um, and really just want their wine to be thought of as wine. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be like this sub culture of wine necessarily, but I do think that Evan's winemaking process, which I admire very deeply, obviously because we chose to work with him. He's pretty low intervention, um, and by the nature of that, you do sometimes get some more like wild character, um, which I sometimes love, sometimes don't. And we've had to work with them a lot through the years to kind of like reel back some of the more out there stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and thankfully, he's been very receptive to that. I think a lot of that comes from just being like a brewer. As brewers, we're trained on off flavors all the time.
Right.
We're like very sensitive to off flavors. And there are things that some people might not think is an off flavor, but we as brewers really struggle to like enjoy a thing that we've been taught is off. And so we've been kind of slowly like tweaking our process to kind of like make the wine a little bit cleaner, even though it's still at the end of the day, it's fermented with native yeast. In order to do that, you have to have organic or biodynamic grapes. We don't filter, we don't use any coloring agents. We don't really use any of the tricks that the like big guys use in wine. But we do actually use a very small amount of sulfites or sulfur, potassium metabisulfite, um, at the end, like basically right before bottling. So some natural wine heads might be like,
Yeah.
oh, that's breaking the rules, you know? But we do it out of an intention to reduce the impact of oxygen that inevitably gets in during bottling. So when we weren't doing that, we were finding that the wines sometimes took like a whole year to like clean up from just that little bit of oxygen that gets in, and it just basically any sort of like wild yeast that's in the wine, which inherently there is when you're doing native yeast fermentation. It's
Yeah.
going to kind of bloom and cause all sorts of weird off flavors that you don't want. So this was kind of our way to
Is it similar? Not, it's not pasteurizing, obviously, but is that kind of like the same end game to add the sulfites?
um not necessarily, because like with pasteurization, basically the general thinking is that you're like locking in the flavor. Like any brewer that pasteurizes, you're locking in the flavor. It really shouldn't change. You're going to have much more shelf stability, but that kind of reduces the element of like having this living product in the bottle. So like wine obviously kind of notoriously, famously ages well,
Hmm.
you know? And so if you were to pasteurize a wine, you're basically saying this can't age. It's never going to really change.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
way that we add sulfur to our wine is that, or the reason why, kind of like scientifically, essentially, it's kind of like in some ways killing some, maybe, you know, like some portion of the yeast, but it's kind of like just fighting against the oxygen ingress. So Evan, again, just having so much more experience with this than me, his take on it is we purposefully select the amount that we add so that in theory it like almost negates itself when oxygen gets in. So he's like, even though there might be like, you know, X parts per million when it's in the tank right before it's bottled, as soon as it's in the bottle, it's like back to zero from like the oxygen.
Hmm.
So anybody that might feel like, you know, they're like averse to sulfites, a lot of people have this like theory that they might get hangovers from sulfites. Like I've never experienced that with our wine. Yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a like geeky tangent, but
No, you're good.
yeah.
I drank a lot of it the other night, and I did not have a hangover in the morning. So
Oh, great, love that. Oh yeah.
yeah. And I will jump to some of the stuff you sent me, but more specifically, you sent the Gamay and the Nebbiolo.
Yeah.
Now, are those? Do you kind of go out and like pick varietals of grapes that you want to mess with, or do you kind of lean on Evan to guide you with that, or how is that going? And are most of them single varietal, or are you doing blends also?
Very good question. So when we first started visuals, we were kind of a little bit more focused on doing blends. And I personally love blends, but uh, the experience that we were having as far as like the customer and their feedback, it seemed to us that um, people wanted more single varieties. Like they could wrap their head around that more. It was a little bit like we were already kind of like in this quasi esoteric new winery world. We were like, let's just kind of dial this back and give somebody a grape name that they've probably heard of and they have some expectation of what they're getting into. And so
Hmm.
we have mostly shifted to all single varieties at this point. Um, as far as your question about like what grape varieties we actually want to work with, it's kind of a combination, honestly, of like us, Doug and I, having a desire for a certain variety that we like, and within the network that Evan has, what he has access to. So, you know, in the beer world, when we work with fruit, you know, any brewer that you ever talk to that works with fresh fruit inevitably is going to talk to you about the relationship with the farmer, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it's such a big part of how you gain access to these things and how you assure that the quality is good. It's all about relationships. And it's especially important in California because, um, you know, there's only so many grapes being grown and there's a lot of wineries, and it can be kind of competitive and it can be hard to get your hands on some. And like certain varieties are also like extremely expensive versus other varieties. And so, yeah, there's been like certain varieties that we wanted to make wine out of that once we like see the price, we're like, nah, that's not going to work for us.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's other times where Evan might be like, I have no idea where to get that. I just don't have any connections, and he'll work on it, and it might take a couple years.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, he has like a pretty big network at this point. His winery has been around for over 10 years. But in other cases, so like we've become really good friends with all the wineries that make wine in this co-op, because they all work really closely together, and they all kind of have their own connections. So some in some cases it's just like they'll reach out to us and be like, hey, I might have some extra of this variety, like would you want some? And like in the case of the Nebbiolo that you mentioned, Sam Bilbro, who is his brand is called Idlewild Wine. He is like Evan's best friend. They've been friends forever. They work extremely closely together. They actually share a tasting room in Healdsburg, so you can go into that tasting room and get both of their wines. They also essentially share like an assistant winemaker. So this guy Mike, who's an amazing, talented winemaker, he kind of works for both of them simultaneously. So their brands are like very interconnected. And uh, Sam's like obsessed with Italian varieties. His winery basically makes almost entirely, I think it is like 100% Italian varieties that are grown in America. So he's really passionate about that, and he actually has his own vineyard, which is not always true. Often not true for some of these like smaller American natural winemakers. And so he's able to really like grow what he wants to grow, and so he is obsessed with Nebbiolo. It's probably his favorite variety, and so he puts a lot of love into it. And so it was kind of just like through that relationship that he kind of like, not that we didn't already like Nebbiolo, but just from knowing him and hearing his stories, it was like, wow, yeah, this is a special grape. Like if you can help us get some of this, we would be super pumped. And he was open to it. So yeah, that wine is always like very special to me for that reason. The Gamay it's just a variety that Doug specifically, and I've come to love it. But Doug was just really into it, and so we were actually looking for Gamay for years before we found it.
Mm.
And that's actually the only grape that we buy and make wine out of that's not from like the North Coast, which is kind of the region right north of San Francisco. That's actually from down near like San Luis Obispo. So it's totally an outlier for us, but it was just kind of like where the connection ended up leading to.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of little, like all of our wines have stories like that, that are tied to people or places or passions of ours or friends of ours or whatever.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I don't want to run out of time before jump into ceremony of seasons, but I just want to say that I think that the aperitifs that you sent, the and I failed to write down the names of them, but the red that went with the fall release, and then the
Yeah.
white, though they were like amazing, and
Oh, fun.
everybody who I was like giving it to was like, this is really good. And just the concept, I know that you had mentioned you're into like botanicals and everything like that, but like all the ingredients you put into this, some of them maybe you necessarily can't pick out, but at the same time, there's like, I can go in each sip and it's like one sip I can pull the coffee, one sip I can pull like the cardamom, I can pull, whatever. And then the white, I was getting a ton of like grapefruit pith, but in like a really delicious way.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Florida and I had a grapefruit tree in my backyard, and it sort of
Oh,
was
wow.
like sort of like a nostalgic like
Yeah.
thing, enjoying it.
I love that. Yeah, man, I could talk about the aperitif program for fucking ever, so I'll try not to. It's something that I'm so passionate about. I feel I was just talking to Meg Mulhern, one of the musicians that I worked with in Ceremony of Seasons, about this, because she was asking me a bunch of questions about the one that we released with her record. And I don't know if I've ever actually said this out loud, but I was like, making aperitif wines is the biggest challenge that I've ever faced in my professional beverage making career. It is such a trip. It is so often so frustrating, but because of that, when it comes together, it is like also the best feeling. It's like such a sense of accomplishment, and yeah. So I get a lot of joy out of making those, and I'm sure if I do this for another few decades, I might start to make some connections that I have yet to make. But it's so fascinating, man, when you're combining all these like different botanicals. A lot of the ones I make have somewhere between like 10 and 25 botanicals in them. Like, just the smallest tweak of percentages of one versus the other, or removing one, adding a new one in, every time it's remarkable how much it changes the flavor.
Yeah.
And it just turns into this new thing. I think that's why I love them so much, and kind of like how you explained it, which is great. Like, every sip can be a little bit of a different experience, but it's like, these beverages in my mind have the potential to be something totally, like truly and utterly unique. Like, when you get all these different botanicals together, often it can be like almost impossible to pick out any one of them. They
Hmm.
just combine into a way that just creates a new flavor. And maybe that flavor, is tied to some memory, or reminds you of something that you've had before, but it's a different thing. And that's like so thrilling to me as a beverage maker and like a beverage lover. It's just so fun.
Yeah, we had like I think there was like five of us that were tasting them, and it was really interesting. Like some people were like, I'm not getting that at all, and others are like, that's like the predominant thing I'm getting. And it was
Right.
just like, it was just fun like interaction that we were having
Yes,
together with it.
it's so true, man. Because like, I love Amaro and vermouth, like I said, and um, I'll often try to, like, if it's one I've never tried before, whatever, like I'll drink it and like not do any research or whatever, and I'll just be like, I want to have like an authentic experience with this. Like, what do I taste? But then I'll later do some research, mostly because I'm curious if any of these ingredients are revealed or not. And like, I'll come across all these tasting notes on the internet, and they're always so different from mine. And yeah,
Yeah,
it's like so individual to the person, which I love. It's just so cool. But also, like,
yeah,
sometimes it's like somebody will say a word. This is my favorite thing about doing sensory. Like, no matter what you're doing sensory on, like, somebody will say a word, and you're like, "Fuck, that's it!" Like, you just couldn't find the word for it,
yeah,
and that's so cool. Like, I love that moment.
yeah. I love what you're doing with that, and I hope you are able to keep going with it and keep pushing the boundaries. But before we jump to ceremony seasons, I just want to ask: are you doing little like pilot batches of these and then having, is there difficulty in upscaling it, or like what's that process like?
Yeah, for sure. It's probably not that dissimilar from the way that like a bourbon producer would blend barrels, or a sour beer producer would blend barrels. Except for me, what I'm doing is I'm making all these individual tinctures of botanicals, using a grape based distillate, like a unaged, unbarreled brandy. That's what the extract medium is. So I'll make all these tinctures in, like gallon or sometimes 5 gallon increments, and then I'll I'll get the whatever wine I want to use is kind of the base. I start off in a spreadsheet and I like do all this math. I mean, I've created a spreadsheet where I can kind of just plug things in and it'll spit out, okay, if the base wine is, let's say, 12% alcohol, and I want the end aperitif to be 15% alcohol, then I need this many, this volume of the distillate, the tinctures, to get there. And then I'm like, okay, I'm trying to decide what tinctures, what botanicals I want to use that make sense in the wine, that like in my mind might fulfill this like vision I have. And then it becomes like very scientific with like graduated cylinders and pipettes, and oftentimes I'll do like a 25 milliliter um, blend. So that's kind of like the bench top trial, if you will. And
Mhm.
I'll do, sometimes upward of like 20 iterations until I get dial it in. And like every single time I do a blend, I'm tasting it, I'm making notes for myself, what's working in this, what's not working in this. Sometimes what you think is working or not working is totally not what's working or not working. And like, I can't even tell you the amount of times that I started down this path and was like, I'm scrapping this. Like, it's just not working. I'm going to totally start over. But yes, your point about the scaling is very real. So I'll obviously take, once I settle in on a blend and I know everything in like milliliter increments, then I scale it up to whatever the full size batch is. But 100% of the time, it does not taste like what the trial tasted like.
Yeah.
So then it becomes another process on a bigger scale of dialing it in, and obviously, like sometimes volumes can be hard to measure precisely on a large scale. So sometimes, the ABV might be a bit off, or all of these wines have a sugar component.
Mhm.
You kind of think about it as like building a cocktail. You have acid, you have sugar, like fruity components, spicy components, whatever. Um, and so, yeah, you're kind of dialing in the sugar. Generally, my approach with the sugar is like I want it to be as as dry as I can make it, with it still being balanced.
Yeah.
So there's so many Amaro and Vermouth out in the world that are unbelievably sweet. And you just can barely drink more than an ounce of it at a time. And that, I still love those. It's still a fun experience, but my goal is to kind of make it be a little bit more approachable than that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think if I sent you the fall one, um,
Yeah.
that kind of has like the road and the autumn scene on the label. That one, I'm blanking on the name of it myself, but that one is the sweetest one I've ever made. That one's kind of almost more of a dessert wine than anything. Yeah, yeah. But all the other ones they normally land like somewhere around, this number might not mean anything to you, but most of the time we talk about it in like grams per liter. Uh,
Okay.
and the Italians actually have a scale of saying like if it's 0 grams per liter to, I'm not going to remember all the numbers, but 20, then it's considered like extra dry. If it's 20 to 50, then it's like semi-dry or whatever. And so almost all of mine land in the dry zone.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's
it's
awesome.
really fun. Yeah. Thank you for asking it.
No problem.
Yeah.
So we have like 10 minutes
Okay.
total left. I'll
Okay.
jump into Ceremony of Seasons, uh, the record label that you started. And I
Yeah.
was just curious to sort of like how that came about and then like with this relationship with visual.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll try to be quick. Basically, I had this vision for a wine club for visuals. Wine clubs are extremely common in the wine world, and it's a lot of ways kind of like the best way for wineries to connect with their audience. So I was just kind of brainstorming ideas of how do I make a wine club that's a little bit different from what's out there, a little bit more like experience based, because that's just like such a ethos that we follow. And so again, it kind of got a little bit personal. Like I thought about the way I like to enjoy beverages, and a lot of times when I have a beverage that I'm like super amped on, I want to kind of create like a almost like a ceremony or a ritual around the consumption of that wine. Just like make it special, like make it memorable. So I might do something like light a candle and put on a record, and get my favorite glass and get in a comfy chair or whatever, and really try to like be into the moment. And so that was essentially the impetus for my wine club. I wanted it to be this experience that you could kind of take home and have all these components that felt very intentional and felt very like cohesive, and celebrated the wine, and also to celebrate the season. So like seasonality is just really important in wine. Um, Most of the winemakers that I know, like can they they just are very in touch with the weather and the season, because you kind of have to be with grapes. And there's certain wineries out there that release wine based off of like the moon cycle and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's just all part of the kind of romance of it. But essentially, I wanted the wine club to have certain elements every time. So I would release them seasonally, so 4 times a year. I was trying to release them on the equinox and the solstice, and I wanted there to always be at least 2 wines included. I wanted there to always be a music component. I wanted there to always be like a recipe component, and be like a merch item of some kind. And then there was other items interspersed, and it was all like Asheville centric. So everything in the package was made by an Asheville based company, or like sourced from an Asheville based company. So the music piece was kind of like the most obvious for me, because I just am a music head and I love to collect records, and I love, music is such a big part of so many like memories, and like just I have music on all at all times of the day.
Yeah.
So I was like, all right, I want to include music. I want to try to make it be as Asheville as possible. Um, how do I do that? So I started to reach out to all these musicians in town that I admire, and I was like, hey, this is my vision. Would you be down to make music for these packages designed to pair with the wine, and to also designed to like pair with the season? And it just so happened that we have a record pressing plant in Asheville, so that made it feasible for me to make records and support an Asheville business, keep it all like true to the vision. And so I got a lot of positive feedback on this concept. So I was like, okay, I'm doing this. How do I do this? So I had to basically, I decided it made the most sense to start a label um, to facilitate the music portion of the wine club.
Yeah.
And so I had no idea how to do that initially, and did a lot of research and talked to a lot of my musician friends, some of which had run labels in the past of their own or currently do. And so the network that I had kind of helped me sort it out. But yeah, Ceremony of Seasons, the name is really meant to illustrate that kind of broader vision of like um, having a moment where you celebrate not only the season, but like the consumption of the music, the consumption of the wine, and the other components that come with it. Um, so yeah, it's been a joy for me. It's been hard. It's been like a lot of work. I've made a lot of mistakes. I'm still figuring it out, but it's been super fulfilling. I mean, to be such a music lover and record collector, to then be like producing your own, it's like
Yeah.
to have records on my shelf that are not only from friends, but like I designed the jacket for it, and I might have taken the photo on the cover, and um, all that stuff. It's really fun.
Yeah. The whole, I mean, you guys are like pressing on, it's like colored vinyl. It's beautiful jackets.
Yeah.
And the idea of having the wine club, you were trying to be able to ferment the wine in Asheville and use that native yeast, but this is, yeah, I think like a good balance to like look like that vision wasn't going to come true.
Right.
Here's the terroir of Asheville, because you
Yes.
have,
Yes.
I mean, you have everything from like the macarons to the honey, which has been in some of these packages that are
Right.
all Asheville based.
Yeah.
Um,
It's great.
I
It's awesome.
I want to have you. There's so much more I have to ask you about, but I'm gonna have to like skip over it. But I do want to say the two albums you sent me, is it Dark Signs or
Dark
Scenes?
Signs. Yeah.
Signs,
Yeah.
and the Meg Mulhern.
Yeah.
Both of those like really, I felt like fit the season.
Nice.
The Dark Signs, the Space Time Paradox. That one had like a kind of like supernatural fall feel to it to me,
Yeah. Cool.
and I felt like the Meg Mulhern, her being the violinist, was very. It brought back like some like more of like an organic like nature feel to it, and but it still felt like winter and sort of dreadful in like a beautiful way.
Right. Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel like that's the way the musicians probably would have explained it, or in some similar way. So yeah,
Yeah,
I totally agree with you. I'm glad that came
that's
through.
beautiful. Yeah. So with the 3 minutes we have left, I'm gonna jump to the outro questions real quick.
Oh yeah, sure.
All right. So number one, favorite beverage.
Favorite beverage is by far and away saison. I'm just such a huge saison fan. Mixed culture saison probably more than anything, but just generally saison.
Awesome. Okay, a song everyone should listen to.
Um, it was probably the song that like most recently blew my mind, and I think it's a good segue for our conversation here. It's a song called "Void" by Harsh Realm, but it's specifically the XOR remix of that song. So this is on Spotify. You should be able to find it. These are both, well, Harsh Realm is an Asheville-based death metal band. XOR is Matthew Bowman, who I'm actually currently working with on my next release. So these are both Asheville-based musicians, and it basically, like, this song is just such a trip. I mean, it's heavy, right? It's death metal is the base, but Matthew had infused this like electronic element to it that it's like, I don't know. The first time I heard that song, it blew my mind. So super rad.
Awesome. Number three, favorite concert you've been to.
Oh man, I've actually told this story. I'm going to try to stay consistent because I've told the story to many people that have asked that question. Back in when I lived in Seattle, there was this thing called Decibel Music Fest. It was like an electronic focused festival, and I went to it every year. And the show, there was this one show. It was in like a concert hall, and it was Raphael Anton Irisari and Simon Scott. It was like a collaborative show. Simon Scott's the drummer for Slow Dive, but he also has like a solo
Oh,
project that's much more experimental. And I just remember when the show was over, I was like, wow, that was insane. But I just remember everybody around me that was like, that changed my life. That kind of like it solidified in my head, like, yeah, that was as special as I thought it was.
awesome.
Yeah.
Favorite place you've had a drink.
I feel really lucky that I got to go to Europe many years ago, and I have been back since. But my Belgium trip was probably my favorite trip. ever, being a beer lover. There was a place called Potter's Fascia, I think it's pronounced. It was in Antwerp, and it was right by this huge like medieval church, and they had all these amazing Belgian beers, and it was just like if I could just teleport anywhere to have a beer, that would be where I would go.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And then, so we're gonna run out of time. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna guilty pleasure for music, and I might have to just add your answer in after this.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I'm curious if it cuts us off hard or not.
It hasn't yet.
Yeah.
Okay, go on,
But
go on.
anyway, what I was thinking was like I said earlier, I'm kind of obsessed with 80s music. I was born in 1980, and I always feel like to some degree 80s music is just like in my blood, and I feel like part of the reason why I love synthesizers so much is like 80s were so synth heavy, and I
Yeah,
love that. And but I also think that to some degree like it's getting like old, you know what I mean? And so some broadly speaking, I feel like 80s music is like maybe getting a little bit embarrassing, but more specifically, I love musicians from the 80s like Phil Collins, or like Peter Gabriel, or Sting, or gosh, who else? Steve Winwood is maybe like I'm obsessed with, and all those guys are basically like adult contemporary artists,
yeah,
which like
yeah,
the name alone of that subgenre is like embarrassing. But
yeah,
yeah, it's kind of like quintessential like dad music, I feel like, for a lot of people. But man, I love that stuff.
yeah. I mean, everybody has their thing, and I
Right?
love
Yeah.
that. So it didn't cut us off. Maybe,
Yeah.
but when we get done, it's gonna be like, oh, to get beyond the 2 hours, you have to do X, Y, Z. We'll find out. But
Right.
while it's still recording, I just want to ask, like, where do you get inspiration? Like, where do you find inspiration on a daily basis?
Oh, it's definitely from music. I mean, um, I'm the type of person that I'm like obsessed with learning about. Like, if I come across music that I'm intrigued by, even if I don't like inherently love it, but I'm just like, what is going on here? That's like so interesting. I'm like, give me all the information that you can. And so because of that, I really love like Bandcamp is probably the thing I use most often. But Bandcamp offers all the labels and musicians that like almost like an infinite amount of space below the music to like describe it. And I read that stuff um, religiously, and I'm also like borderline like an unhealthy amount obsessed with discovering music. I my wife often tells me like if I put half the amount of time that I put into discovering music into like learning a new skill or something like that, I could like take over the world.
Yeah,
But it brings me so much joy and pleasure to discover new music. And yeah, I don't know. I guess the music industry as a whole, the way that bands present themselves, the way that labels or distributors or music writers like talk about music, explain music, romanticize music, album covers, uh, the whole world of music, I think, is just so fascinating. Um, and it, yeah, like I feel pretty confident that like if you understand that about me and you were to like really pay close attention to what I do professionally, it would be pretty evident that that's kind of like where I'm coming from. So yeah, I mean, I think to some degree nature, like I feel like oftentimes when I often go for like walks on my street, which is I live in a pretty cool little like outside of Asheville town called Leicester. There's like a horse farm across the street from me, and there's like a little creek, beautiful creek down the end of the road, and everybody around here has like good amount of land, so it's not like too dense. And so I take
Mhm.
a lot of walks down my street with headphones on, and and sometimes I bring like the camera with me, take photos, or sometimes I have a field recording device that honestly, like, I don't really do much with the recordings that I make, but I've just found that, and this is true for like taking photographs too, when you're like in this headspace of like documenting what you're observing, it makes you like hypersensitive to what's going on. And so
Yeah.
I've just come to like do it as a process, just because I feel like it makes me enjoy the experience on a deeper level. But yeah, like a lot of times moments like that, um, a lot of the types of music that I listen to when I'm doing that tend to be more like ambient, drone, wordless music. So that type of music, I feel like lends to your mind kind of wandering. And so yeah, I've come to love those moments where my mind just kind of goes off, and maybe nothing comes of it, but I feel like a lot of my like best ideas kind of come from moments like that.
I love that.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of the band Sons of Kemet?
I have, yeah, the like
Okay,
the jazz
okay.
band from the UK.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
just like I'd heard you mention before you were kinda getting into jazz, and I just feel like that they embody sort of like several different things about music that you enjoy.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think, isn't Shabaka Huckings? Am I saying it right?
Hutchings, yeah.
Hutchings, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that guy has like, I try to pay attention to all of his projects. He has a few
Yeah.
different things. I think he has a solo album coming out soon.
Yeah,
Um,
they just, like, announced a couple different vinyl releases.
yeah,
I'm, like, on the fence about which one to pull the trigger on.
yeah, yeah. And then I think that obviously within jazz, there's like so many subgenres, and I think I can't tell. It's one of those things where like, how you like when you buy a new car and then all of a sudden you like notice that car everywhere.
Mhm.
Like whatever, I don't know if there's a word for that like psychological thing, but it's one of those things I think about a lot. I'm like, has this type of jazz always existed and I just now discovered it? Or is this like a moment in jazz? I don't know the answer to that. But I feel like there's definitely a moment, specifically in like the UK, um, and a little bit in like Australia too. I've just found some stuff that, to me, it just speaks to me, and I think it has like a psychedelic element to it. In some cases, it has like almost like a world
Yeah.
music, or like African influence. Sometimes it has like a kraut rock influence, like very repetitive. Um, I don't know. Just, yeah, there's the jazz world right now is really exciting. Actually, I since I listened to the podcast, or have I, I came to realize that you asked those questions at the end, and so
Yeah.
I was actually kind of like thinking about how we would answer it, and um, I'm sure you can only imagine that the music question had like
Yeah.
about a
Yeah.
million answers that I wanted to say, but I almost said, I was thinking like I should maybe mention an album like I'm very hotly anticipating right now, and one that just ties into this conversation that you may or may not know about. Do you know the band Ill Considered? Ever heard of them?
Considered.
Ill
The
Considered.
name sounds familiar, but I'm not I might just be, like, piecing together other things.
Yeah. If you should totally check them out, because I feel like you'd appreciate it. It is also from the UK, and they have a few albums now. They just released a new album coming out in a couple months. I think they have like two singles available from the new album, but yeah, it's hard to really pinpoint like what it is about that band, that group, that I love, but it hits so hard for me. So you should check it out.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm just looking at like the fans also like section, and like
Yeah.
Theon Cross, I love.
Yeah.
Binker and Moses is a little like out there, but
Right.
I appreciate them. No, but I appreciate the heads up on things. But for some reason, like listening to you for talk about music and everything like that, I in my head I was like, I bet he would like Sons of Kemet.
Yes.
It's funny, yeah.
Yeah. I
No.
think that Nick Nuns, who's the owner of True Brewing, he introduced me to them a couple years ago. We did this thing around when Burn Pile happened. It happens every year in the fall, but a couple years ago, we were like really trying to brainstorm unique ways to like entertain the brewers that were visiting. And at the time, I want to say it was maybe 2020. No, I forget. But anyway, at the time at Forestry Camp, we were exclusively playing vinyl.
Hmm.
We had this really cool record player that you could basically load like 6 vinyls onto it, and you could press play and it would basically play nonstop for a couple hours. So we took like any brewer that was interested to Harvest Records, one of the record stores in town, and we were like, pick any record you want, like we'll pay for it, and it'll go into like the Forestry Camp collection. That'll be
Hmm.
like your contribution. I'm pretty sure Nick was there, and I think he picked a Sons of Kemet album. And I was like, he was like, "Do you know what this is?" And I was like, "No." It's like, "You're gonna love it." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Yes, yes." And now
The
Nick lives
two.
in Asheville. They're like opening a True in Asheville.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I just love like and when I tell people about it, I'm like, there's two, like, picture this. There's two drummers and a tuba is leading the bass line. Like, it's, and
Yeah,
everyone's
that
looking at
is
you like you're crazy.
a
But
trippy idea, but it works, man. It
yeah,
works.
yeah. All right, man. I'm gonna let you get out of here because I know it's getting late and you
Yeah,
probably got stuff to do tomorrow.
yeah,
But
man. All good. It's
I
been a
really
great
appreciate
convo.
it. Yeah, I feel like I could just like talk to you for 2 more hours and it would still be going.
I know, I know.
Um,
It's great.
but
It's fun. It's cool to have so many things to wax poetic
yeah,
about.
my wife is heading out to Asheville, I think this December, but I'm
Oh, really?
like, if there was a way I could tag along, it's a girls trip, so I'm not gonna be able to tag along. But I was
Right.
like, I need
Yeah.
to get back out there.
Yeah,
Um,
man. If you're ever in town, please hit me up. I'd love to like show you around and take you to our spots. Maybe see a
I
show together.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, well, all right. Until next time, everybody, listen to some new music and drink some new wine, beer, aperitifs, cider, coffee,
Yeah.
all of it. All
Awesome.
right, cheers,
Cheers.
cheers, everybody.